Now we were ready for the big day. Waitangi Day 2022 was the target date, which would have made it precisely 2 years to the day since she sank. Of course, nothing ever happens quite to plan or on time, and on our lifting day it took far longer than anticipated to fit the long ropes and that first series of bags, just to get her rising off the bottom. Fighting current and exhaustion, we finally managed to get her floating, but only about 3 meters up from the sea bottom. We then drifted and dragged her just over a nautical mile towards the Coromandel before she started snagging on the bottom and the tide swung back around. So we put her back down on the bottom again, in 40 meters of water, releasing most of the surface lift bags and leaving the straps and some submerged bags in place. While it was disappointing, I was also happy. My lift bag design had proved itself up to the task, and I now had a good idea of how many bags were required to get her off the bottom. 7, as it turned out. It was a few weeks before wind and tide were favourable and we could head out again, and this time we were much more efficient. This was due to a combination of those straps and bags already being in place, and also because the crew were now experienced at preparing and passing the bags down to the divers. We got her floating quickly, and soon got her close enough to the surface for those in the towboat to be able to see her outline. It was surreal to see an 8-ton boat suspended in mid-water, covered in marine growth, and with her stainless steel propellers glinting in the sunlight. We made sure she was secure, with plenty of redundant bags at the surface supporting her weight, and attached a new tow rope. This time we got a full 6 hours of towing time, and I was relieved when she started dragging the bottom in 17 meters of water, just outside Elephant Cove. We released most of the surface bags again, so she settled down on the bottom and made our way home. This marked the end of stage 1, and the longest and most dangerous part of the recovery was now over. At this point, I could confidently plan what I would do once she was out the water again. A couple of trips out to Elephant Cove were on the cards next, preparing her for the final lift. Cyclone Cody hit in the middle of this, so my first trip out was to check the submerged lift bags were still in place. In the process, I discovered we'd inadvertently set her down on her starboard side, so I had to organise another trip to deploy 3 more bags to again lift her stern, straighten her up, and then set her down upright again. We also did more work on clearing extraneous ropes and some of that net off the outside of the hull. It was now time for the final stage of the plan. We needed to float her up to the surface and then get her as high out of the water as possible. The ideal would have been to get her to float at deck level, but I realised that was completely unrealistic. At a minimum, I needed about half of the upper cabin wall to be protruding above the water, although the tidal range on the final day would determine whether I needed her higher than this. Multiple water pumps were purchased and configured, safety boats were arranged, and a couple of friends called in to help with the lift. The tides were right and weather conditions near perfect when a small flotilla set out from Auckland early in April. We started by again lifting her stern first, then fitted additional straps tightly under the bow to bring her hull up level. Further complications ensued, including the remnants of that bloody net that was still obstructing parts of the boat. By the time we got her floating level and just below the surface, we were again out of time for the tide. Frustratingly, the only option was to pull her into even shallower water and put her down yet again, this time horizontally and in just 7 meters of water. Yet another cyclone threatened, and with autumn's unsettled weather now approaching, it looked like a long delay was on the cards. Luckily, the cyclone's path shifted offshore, and miraculously the first 2 days of the Easter weekend looked to be perfect. With most of my previous crew away for the long weekend, and a few of the lift bag straps needing repair, it was a hectic week trying to pull it all together. In the end, I had 3 other divers volunteering to come along for an overnight adventure, and we headed to Elephant Cove one last time. No flotilla this time, just one boat. However, we did have an audience, with 8 other boaties choosing the bay for their overnight anchorage. Little did they know their sleep would be disturbed. As it turned out, the tide times were even better for us over this weekend than they had been the previous week. The tidal range had also increased to 2.1 meters, and high tide was now at 6:30 in the evening. Hence we had the whole day to get her to the surface. And as it turned out, we needed every minute of that time, as well as the extra tidal range. After 6 hours of work and just an hour short of high tide, we had her roof just above the water, but she was still lower than I'd hoped. I was worried we would not get her high enough. Luckily, a frantic effort in the last hour, inflating several bags between the twin hulls and fitting bags right inside her cabin, saw her roof rise about half a metre above the surface. Not nearly as high as I thought we needed, but it would have to do. We pulled her to the shallows by means of a pulley and a rope that we had earlier attached to a huge rock on shore. Then the dive boat could motor outwards, pulling that rope, and result in Divecat moving inwards. Once she stopped moving, we anchored and pulled everything tight. Now we had to wait, and were some very tired divers who tucked into dinner. Around 10:30, a couple of us transferred ourselves and all the pumping equipment onto Divecat, which now had her watered down to the gunwale. Still 2 hours to low tide, and I needed the level to drop another half a metre. It was going to be close. Eventually, just after midnight, it had dropped just far enough for us to start pumping the forward compartments. So we started some high-volume petrol pumps and began to shift water. The rattle of the motors reverberated around the cliffs of the cove, and no doubt did not make us any friends with the other boaties trying to sleep. The efficiency of these pumps is amazing, although the water pressure from the outlet was so high that it tended to shift the entire pump sideways. Once we had made a significant difference in the water level in the first compartments, we moved the petrol pump to the next one and dropped a high-volume 12-volt bilge pump in to take care of the remaining water. At the same time, I hammered rubber bungs into all the original through-hull openings that I could find, and so we worked our way through all 6 compartments, progressively lowering the water level in each. Once again it was touch and go, and we probably only beat the rapidly incoming tide by about 10 minutes. Just after 1:30 in the morning, we felt her starting to float again. After several cups of coffee and a good breakfast, we spent a couple of hours preparing her for the tow home. Luckily, her anchor winch on the bow was still solid and well attached to the bow, so that was our tow rope anchoring point. We started the slow journey home with a 45-metre long tow rope to tow her across the 43-metre deep water, just in case. We kept 2 people on board in wetsuits and life jackets and in constant radio contact in case of any issues. Across the Firth of Thames we held our speed to just 4 knots, but once in sheltered and shallower water along the bottom end of Waiheke, we shortened the tow rope and managed to pick the speed up to 6 knots. At this point I succumbed to waves of emotion as I realized we were finally going to be successful. More than 2 years of effort, tens of thousands of dollars spent, and more than 30 trips later, she was coming home. Blood, sweat and tears had been shed in the intervening time, and many more tears were shed that day. Once I'd pulled myself together again, I called the marina to organize an emergency lift. Just after 5 p.m, we pulled her alongside the wharf at Half Moon Bay Marina. Job done. When they lifted her, we discovered she was carrying nearly 4 tons of sludge, silt, marine growth and absorbed water, which explained her low position in the bow. Over the ensuing days, we removed 4 full skip bins of ruined joinery and furnishings, and 8 large wheelie bins of pure sludge. Much more work to go, but the underlying hull is in remarkably good condition. Now the saga of her rebuild begins.